In terms of sheer numbers, Iran has got considerably more armed forces than Israel, but their standard of training and equipment is probably less. I mean, they've had years and years of sanctions going back right the way back to 1979. Nonetheless, they themselves have acquired particular expertise in some areas, rockets, missiles, and they have quite a reasonable level of kind of cyber capability. Israel's great problem is not the quality of their forces, which are extremely high, very well trained, very, very technical, but the sheer numbers they've got.
Troops and tanks at the moment amassing on the Lebanese border with an Israeli ground invasion reported imminently. Let's speak to Colonel Simon Diggins OBE, Defence, Security and Military Analyst and a former British Army officer. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Kate.
Colonel, thanks for joining us. What would a ground incursion into Lebanon look like? What kind of scale are we looking at here?
I mean, a large scale. I mean, not necessarily the same scale at the moment as took place into Gaza, but certainly significant in order to have the effect the Israelis will be looking at. They'll use a combination of forces. They've already, we understand, reporting in the New York Times this morning, they've already had a series of special forces operations into southern Lebanon to identify where the potential targets are. They'll use a combination of helicopter forces, tanks, armed personnel carriers, artillery, and obviously close air support as well. So a significant all-arms manoeuvre to try and achieve their objectives.
Yeah, and as I've said, we know tanks are amassing on the border. Could we just talk about Israel's sort of military might in light of the fact that the Israeli Prime Minister says there is nowhere in the Middle East Israel cannot reach? They are prepared to take the fight all the way to Iran. We're not just talking about the axis of resistance here, but we are talking about the mothership, aren't we, effectively? What is Israel's might compared to Iran's might, military might? Now, appetite's going to be different. I think we've already seen that so far. But if we're just looking at this on a military or from a military perspective, who is the stronger nation, Israel or Iran?
In terms of sheer numbers, Iran has got considerably more armed forces than Israel, but their standard of training and equipment is probably less. I mean, they've had years and years of sanctions going back right the way back to 1979. Nonetheless, they themselves have acquired particular expertise in some areas, rockets, missiles, and they have quite a reasonable level of kind of cyber capability. Israel's great problem is not the quality of their forces, which are extremely high, very well trained, very, very technical, but the sheer numbers they've got. And particularly if they find themselves involved, as they've already found themselves in Gaza, with a prolonged counterinsurgency operation in southern Lebanon. The numbers start to count because insurgencies and counterinsurgencies just eat up soldiers in terms of numbers, the casualties, but also just the sheer numbers you need just to survive, to protect yourself, to resupply yourself. And effectively, what will then Israel end up with is effectively three counterinsurgencies ongoing at the same time. Gaza hasn't been completely cleared, and nor will it be. Southern Lebanon, the West Bank, as you say, attacks against the Houthis in the Yemen, and then some kind of action potentially against Iran as well. At some point, the numbers start to count against them, and so they'll be looking to try and achieve as much as they can, as quickly as they can. And then what? Some kind of peace deal, some kind of ceasefire. I mean, who's going to have a peace deal or a ceasefire with them? And that's the real challenge. It's not just the tactics of this, however challenging they are, is what is the end state of this? What are they trying to achieve by this? And that seems to me to be rather unclear.
Yeah, I was about to ask you that question, and now I know the answer, really. What does Israel want out of this? They are desperate to move the residents of northern Israel back into their homes on that border with Lebanon, and that is what we know that they definitely want to do. But they have, I think, perhaps responded to a greater extent in that desire to get Israelis back into their homes. We can totally understand that. They have perhaps responded with more might and more ferocity than any of us could have anticipated. If we're talking about negotiations, if we're talking about a ceasefire, what do Israel want? What are Israel hoping to bring to the table to bargain with, I suppose?
And I think that's a real issue. It's very, very unclear. I mean, the kind of concept, I think, behind the way Netanyahu is operating is not really in a way that we understand in terms of, you defeat an enemy and then you try and achieve a peace deal. What he's trying to do is something much larger.
Well, he's taking on the whole of the Middle East now, isn't he?
Well, he is. I mean, and he said that. He said that October the 9th. he stood up and said, our response to what's happening will reshape the Middle East for generations. And I say to me, that's exactly what he's been seeking to do, which means more than just simply defeating the enemy. But they have this doctrine in Israel, what they call double deterrence, which is not to deal with the problem, but deal with it in such a ferocious manner that people don't come back for a second helping. And that's obviously what he's trying to do. But all that talks about then is basic security. So effectively what he's doing is essentially promising the Israeli people that we will have a security response, in other words, a violent military response to any threat that comes to us, which rather knocks out of the window any possibility of a sort of peaceful, stable solution, which all of us, at least theoretically in the West, we're working on in terms of looking for a two-state solution, which has been on the table since 2005, 2006, but has made little or no progress. And that's partly because of this emphasis on security and if you like, a violent response, and not on trying to do peace building and building the bridges required.
Yeah, that is not something that the Israeli government wants, certainly not the Prime Minister, but also particularly the right wing of his parliament, of his government as well. What role, Simon, could the Lebanese government play? We sort of forget sometimes in calling Hezbollah a terrorist organisation. They're a paramilitary organisation, but they also have a stake in the government of Lebanon as well. Go on.
Absolutely. I mean, this is an extraordinary country of 5 million people with a mixture of Christians, varieties of Muslims, varieties of Christians, Druze, which somehow has held itself together under enormous pressure. And it's had a very difficult 30 or 40 years from the Israeli invasion in 1982 onwards, and yet holds itself together. And as you rightly say, Hezbollah, seen by us as, oh, well, this is a prescribed terrorist organisation. But actually, they have seats in the Lebanese parliament. And they also have allies amongst the Christians as well. So they are an integrated part of Lebanese society. Now, the Lebanese government, I think it was last Monday, when the Lebanese ambassador UK said, if we're invaded, we will respond, by which means he said the Lebanese army will defend themselves, which immediately puts the British government in a particularly difficult place, because actually we've been training the Lebanese army. So we've got a sort of dilemma before he even begins. But they'll also be looking to try and look after the rest of the population of Beirut and other parts of the country that have been attacked, because as your previous correspondent said, there's already significant displaced persons, a significant refugee movement, and potentially a significant humanitarian crisis. So the Lebanese government will try to judge exactly how they're going to use their limited forces. Do you try and defend against Israel, which militarily is much stronger, or do you use those forces like to maintain order and try and look after the humanitarian situation? But those things are going to get very mixed up together. And let's face it, Israel's had a significant amount of attacks against it. But if it attacks Lebanon, it's moving into an independent country. And that is really noteworthy.
Look, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate your expertise. Please come and speak to us again soon. Colonel Simon Diggins, OBE, thank you. Defence, security and military analyst, former British Army officer who served in the Middle East. Great depth of knowledge there. When we come back, Britain's most senior civil servant, Simon Case, has announced he'll resign at the end of the year. We'll look at what that means. And we're getting plenty of extracts from Boris Johnson's memoir. We'll dig into that with Alicia Fitzgerald.